Are they doing okay or not so okay? Dan Collins, who has lived in China for some 20 years, gives us his take on China's economy and more in this episode of Silver Bullion Television. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira, part of the outreach team of Silver Bullion here in Singapore, where we want to help you truly secure your wealth. Dan Collins joins us today. Dan is a former General Motors plant manager and founder of Tyrell Chemical and Medical, and he is the host of the podcast titled Chaos Incorporated. And Dan has run businesses in China and lived there for some 20 years. And he's going to give us his take, his insights about the economy, business, and tariffs. We're delighted to have Dan join us once again today. It's time to saddle up and silver up for Dan Collins. Dan, welcome back to SBTV. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Good to be back.
Glad to have you back on. And this time it wasn't so long. I think we're only about 3 months now between interviews. So I kept my promise not to make another year. And again, glad to have you back on. And in fact, last time we spoke, we talked about tariffs and they were pretty fresh. And you were saying how tariffs were going to be more difficult for the US than it would be for China. Are you sticking to that same assessment?
I am, yeah. I will say, since we talked last time, the U.S. thus far has weathered the tariff adjustments pretty well. Much better than expected. The stock market here in the U.S. is at all-time highs, or close to them. The issue, though, is that the tariffs really haven't gone in yet. So everyone's been around 10% so far. So I have a customer, I put in a $20 million annual price increase last week. So the tariffs are now going in. People pulled ahead inventory. You saw Q1 numbers, GDP higher than expected. All right, people pulled ahead inventory 3 months, even 6 months in some cases. That's now all been sold out. They've been waiting. Now the tariff picture is much clearer on who's going to get what percent. Many of us, as you know, we forecasted. I was warning before last time on your show that 145% tariff on China would destroy the global economy. I still am with that. I still totally believe that. I've been a proponent of tariffs for the U.S. to reindustrialize, but smart tariffs. I would have done it product line by product line as opposed to a blanket tariff on everything. You know, it makes no sense to tariff coffee per se when we don't make coffee, we don't grow coffee, right? So these are simple things where you want to balance out the most economic growth combined with reindustrializing your economy. We may have discussed before about the general free market. You know, the world's not a free market. It's not as simple as economists make it out in their textbooks. There really is no such thing as free trade. There's all kinds of things. So each country has to balance for themselves about the most optimum level of, production plus imports and exports. So yeah, I am. Hopefully, we're down now. China, in particular, our tariff rates today on most products are around 55%. So that's a Section 301, and that's higher than people realize. We have a Section 301, and then we got 20% new tariffs under Trump. So that combines around 55%. We could get more later if there's no deal done. So I think anything higher than this is really going to be a strain on the U.S. economy. I think a lot of areas of the U.S. economy are moving downward all at the same time. So, yeah, we're still in the early days in the tariffs, though. So we haven't seen that big price pop yet, but it's coming. I think we'll see that this quarter.
In the beginning, as you said, we've heard a lot of economists saying, the wheels are going to come off for the U.S., everything's going to fall apart. And then lately, we've been hearing people say, well, okay, the tariffs really didn't do anything. U.S. seems to be doing okay. So I knew you would know what the balance was between the two. So basically, there there's still a bit more time to go before we actually see these things, the first bout take effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, mainly we've been paying about a 10%. China's been around 50% so far, but hopefully if it doesn't go up, you saw the EU trade deal which just happened big, there was a lot of whining and crying over that in Europe. Europe got a 0% duty they gave US 0%, but US put 15% on them. But on the other hand, US has been paying security for Europe for 70 years, That's why they can afford health insurance. We've paid for their military. So they also have had duties against the US, roughly 10% forever. So German car makers are partly owned by the state, right? And their labor unions. It's not a free market. So as I mentioned, these aren't freely traded free market capitalist economies per se. So it is what it is, but the European trade relationship's about $2 trillion annually. That's roughly twice what it is in China. But in terms of number of widgets, China dominates everything, right? In terms of actual physical production. So the China US trade relationship, I think, is absolutely the most important in terms of living standards. To keep products moving, keep things flowing. So yeah, hopefully we stay around these levels. We don't get any crazier. I think if they try to, tariff them 100% for Russian oil or something, that could collapse everything real quick.
Yeah, and I know they've been talking they've been talking about more sanctions on Russia as well. So absolute uncertainty all over the place. And I think what we're seeing right now are the strengths of the U.S. and the strength of China. And last time we spoke, you floated the idea of that G2 being, of course, U.S. and China. With tariffs well underway, and we're looking at a second round of tariffs and whatnot. Is a G2 now really something to consider, maybe more than we did before?
I would propose the G2, of course. I don't think we're moving that way in geopolitical circles, the foreign policy establishment. I think they're working the other way. But yeah, obviously, U.S. and China are now a G2 basically in everything. Europe just not in the picture. Look at the AI, look at search, look at growing companies. It's like Europe's becoming a museum economically. That's for tourism. You know, so yeah, they're out of the race, and it's basically China versus U.S. So I've always proposed let's do a G2. Let's do it's a competition, but a friendly competition, and lift the world's living standards, keep the global chaos, contained in terms of all these. You see, the world's getting more chaotic militarily with the clashes everywhere. So you need strong leadership, and there's no reason for U.S. and China to be at loggerheads. We're on other sides of the world. We're huge trading partners. There's a lot of areas we can work on. China, I think, is about to take the mantle with a lot of R&D and new development of innovation products. So the whole world is going to benefit from this. Some of the things you see coming out of life sciences and their scientific technical establishment are incredible. So where America has had to invent everything for the last, say, 70 years, now it's going to get some help from China. So I think it's good times as long as we cooperate. I think the foreign policy group, though, these guys want war all the time everywhere, and they want to confront everybody everywhere all the time. And and it's a horrible mindset that comes out of Washington D.C. right now, where they basically want to create chaos everywhere instead of stability, which is what they should be doing.
Let's say with manufacturing, Dan, I think we can safely assume there are things that the Chinese are better at, and likewise, I think we can safely assume that there are some things that the U.S. is better at. But you brought up that point where do you think each will have its own space and work within what they are good at and where the whole world benefits, or will both or one country just decide to go after every sector, every industry they can and hurt the other and potentially hurt the world?
So yeah, it's interesting. The U.S. obviously China's a Goliath of manufacturing. Everybody knows this. I mean, it's like unprecedented. But they're not the only one. Before them was Japan, and then South Korea. These countries are focused all their energy on manufacturing and export. It's called the East Asian Economic Miracle. The whole region built up by exporting. You then gain capital, then you reinvest the capital in the social, bettering the social conditions, bringing up education, and then climbing the technical value chain up, so your society becomes more prosperous. Prosperous. We saw it in Japan. We saw it in South Korea. We saw it in Taiwan, and then China copied that model, and now we see Vietnam copying the model. It works, right? If you can run a trade surplus with people. Problem is you have to protect your own market to do that. And Japan has done that forever. So has South Korea. They don't buy cars from each other. They're not going to buy cars from US, right? So what's happened now is Japan and South Korea, when they industrialized, you had some big areas in US take big hits like Detroit and Ohio, Pennsylvania steel, and we called that the Rust Belt. Well, now China's so big that it's just displaced everything. They've displaced not only manufacturing US but everywhere else. Korea's getting hit, Japan is getting hit. So in China's model, they're 1.4 billion people. There can't be. They have to. They're already what I call a consumption economy. That's most of the GDP, but their economy, their manufacturing economy, is so large, and it's not free trade, right? A lot of these companies are state-owned enterprises, and even when you're a free market private company, you still get a lot of access to government funds, subsidized bank loans, these kinds of things. So China at its core is not a free market economy. The US, I mean, it's a basically state-owned backbone layer of companies with the world's most competitive free market enterprises attached to that. So the US has become so deindustrialized. We make 9 million cars a year. That's what we made in 1970. The electrical output has not moved in 2 decades. Okay. We make our economy, our manufacturing economy is almost nil, right? It's basically assembly shops now in the United States, warehouses and Amazon. So the U.S. has to reindustrialize. We can't make a ship, right? We made one ship last year. China made 1,000 ocean-going container ships. So the U.S. has now realized this is a national security issue. You can't be a nation of 330 million people and just make nothing. We print the money, we send it out, we get the goods. That system has worked for 40, 50 years, but it's coming to an end. We're almost 40 trillion in debt. We just keep printing money. We keep racking up the society issues, right? 100,000 fentanyl deaths a year because people don't have gainful employment. There's the middle class is disappearing day by day. Many people say it's already gone. And there's many areas of the country now you need $100,000 salary to be considered even middle class. People can't make it anymore. So the inflation in the last 3, 4, 5 years, when we set off that inflation with the money printing after COVID, that has triggered a whole new model rethink. So U.S. has to try to rebalance, keep the global trade system intact, while at the same time trying to reindustrialize. You have seen the tariffs bring in roughly $500 million. It's going to be this year, which is incredible. You're talking about when the full tariffs are on, the U.S. may close half of its annual trade deficit. Its budget deficit will be closed. So right now, every year we're on $1.5 trillion deficit right now. Half of that will be captured in duties. So they're trying to rethink the model right now. They have they're not institutional guys up at the top in the Trump administration, but they're business guys. They're going with their gut instinct. I think they got half the country around them that's supporting, and the other half are scared to death. So because things are changing, but it had to change. But we'll see. We'll see what happens here the next few quarters.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, and I think half the country is going this way, that way, this way, that way. One day they're okay, next day they're scared. So totally agree with you there. You said something interesting though, and it brought me back to this book I read a long time ago called Commanding Heights. Basically, these are things like the public utilities, natural resources sectors relating, I think relating to both foreign trade, domestic trade, things like that. The U.S. government, once upon a time, had these things, the commanding heights. Then I believe they privatized them, sold them off. And to my knowledge, China, as you mentioned, they kept theirs. Many became state-owned enterprises, and so I'm curious with how you refer to that East Asian economic policies or beliefs. How would you compare, let's say, keeping a nation's commanding heights
Yep.
versus selling their commanding heights?
Yep. So I think it's this privatization in the U.S., especially around infrastructure, has been largely not great. It's kind of been a disaster. So we have the ideology, rightly so, governments can't manage anything. What China did is they kind of rewrote the model. We learned, all the communist countries basically collapsed. They had nothing. They had food lines. They couldn't do anything. Russia, which is the world's largest wheat exporter today, was the world's largest wheat importer under communism. They couldn't even grow wheat efficiently. So we learned that, governments can't do anything. So we use that ideology. We privatize everything. But what you have, like, I'll take the power sector as an example. China, it's all state owned and it's most efficient in the world. They've built out a grid that is the size of the entire world in the last 10 to 15 years. Everything's new, and their electrical rates, are at world lows, right? What they can generate and distribute electricity for, those are through state owned companies. So China has solved this thing with owning the company and yet somehow being efficient. I think because they have multiple state-owned companies and they make them compete. And then they also invite the private companies in to compete. This creates an ecosystem of competition that brings costs down, but yet gives them the levers of control to kind of direct people what they want done. Hey, I want power built here. I want power built there. In the United States, we're largely now regionalized monopolies of power that have been privatized, and they're rent seeking. They're going quarter to quarter on their stock price. I need more money. Raise the price. Don't spend that. Don't refurbish that. Don't maintain that. Our electrical grid's creaking here in the U.S., and we're at the cusp of having to double power capacity because of AI and EVs. So the future technology will be won in the world by electrical power generation. Who can build it out fastest to support these industries, robotics, reindustrialization? Yet we're not set up to do that. And if you look at the power graphs of how much new power has been put in place, it's comical. I mean, you see China just go straight up, and U.S. has just been flat for 30 years. So yeah, there needs to be a rethink around these lines, the commanding heights, as you mentioned. Can we do something in that, in power? We got healthcare. You look at a year ago, we were at $700 for insulin per month, something that costs $10, right? At what point does the government just not say, you know what, guys, forget you. We're going to set up an insulin plant and make sure people get insulin for $5 a piece, right? So there are these commanding heights. The U.S. probably needs to rethink it. China kept their banking system. China controls banking, oil and gas. They're very hands-on the healthcare. They're directing, okay, you can set up a hospital here, but you're going to charge X, Y, and Z for this. So the U.S. system is running out of control with the free market. It's not even free market. It's monopolistic capitalism in many areas. It's not competitive. So the U.S. ecosystem needs to be totally rethought, I think, in terms of drop the ideologies of private versus state owned and start to rethink what's going to catch the cat. As Deng Xiaoping said, if it's black or white cat, I don't care as long as it catches the mice. So U.S. needs a total rethink around this area. So
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. Uh, well, what's interesting is when you describe that Eastern Asia economic model, did this stem out of, and I'm going to say because they were labeled as third world countries, there was a lot of poverty. So, was it that hunger that
yep.
drove them out of this? And does the U.S. still have that hunger?
The East Asian economic model, I literally studied this in college. It was well known. I had a whole class on it, actually. That's going back 30 years. So it all started with Japan, and then they called them the Four Tigers. I think it was South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. And then China followed the model, which is, as I mentioned, basically you just export your way. You set up your workers as an export base. You export out, and as you do that, you invite the FDI, which is a key component, foreign direct investment. The capital comes in. Your workers learn how to operate the machines, and I saw this in China, running factories for 25 years. Next thing you know, your foreman goes and starts his own little shop, doing some sub-assembly part. Right? It's just an ecosystem of positive reinforcement. And to your point, Patrick, a lot of maybe young people don't realize how poor Asia was. I mean, you're talking about 1960 Korea was like sub-Saharan level Africa poverty. So I used to work with guys, some South Koreans, they'd be 80 now, but they're probably 50 at the time. They said, I remember one guy telling me, Dan, you don't understand. When I was young, we didn't have food. Like we went to bed hungry, literally hungry. So yeah, East Asia has pulled themselves up out of this, most of it, especially East Asia, Southeast Asia as well, which are, completely different than they were 30, 40 years ago. And you've got these places that are like world class, like now, like Singapore, where you're at, or, most of the cities of China. China, someone told me yesterday, which is true, China has 30 Singapores, you know, or 40. I mean, the cities that have been built up and the infrastructure are incredible. So everyone's trying to do this now. India now is trying to do this. That's why you invite Foxconn in and Apple iPhone assembly, learn how to manufacture, learn how to do stuff. So the problem is now that model has been around for 50 years, and the milk cow called the U.S. is kind of gone dry, right? It's 40 trillion in debt. It's deindustrialized. This middle class is gone. So that, I don't know if that model of sending to the U.S. will work anymore. So I know China in particular, they're looking, how do you restructure an economy this fast, right? When you in one or two generations jumped so high to where the grandparent could barely read and write, and the grandchild has a master's degree in AI. You're talking about just such a jump of society in such a short time. So how do you pivot all that? China doesn't have the young people that want to work in the factories anymore. Those all need to kind of move out, right? They'd rather work in a Starbucks than sit in a factory all day. They're experiencing that middle income trap, the same thing we saw in US, going back to the 80s and 70s, 80s and 90s. So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's kind of like the world economy is the best of times and the worst of times, right? We've got all these great things coming on stream in terms of longevity, healthcare, AI, but at the same time, we've got a lot of restructuring troubles ahead as well. So.
With China, I hear both things, where I think the government reported north of 5% GDP, and then I see how young people, they say that they're struggling, just to have a decent meal, and so from your contacts, from what which which way are things? Is it a bit of both, or I mean, just kind of curious here because I think people are genuinely interested.
Yeah, so the Chinese economy, there's no food insecurity in China. So I mean, it's not that far. The youth unemployment is high, right? People aren't getting the jobs they would want. As I mentioned, you got to remember that their parents were factory workers, but they've got a master's degree. So there's this massive shift of, 500 million workers that want to go from factories to white collar in within 20 years. So how does the economy pivot from that? The economy has been set up to over export. That's really the issue in China. It's export, 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 keep the currency locked, don't over consume. Although China's the world's second largest importer. It's not like it's not a consumption economy. It is. But they're trying to rebalance. There was this massive boom, right? They built 80 new New York cities in the last two decades. So that's come to an end now. There's so much housing that they don't know what to do with it, right? Especially in tier 2, tier 3 cities. So they're now going through a housing overhang. They've tried the world's not big enough to export their way out of anymore for China. It's just not that big. China already does half of the world's manufactured product. So they're switching to this consumption economy, but how to keep it productive. It's happening. I think China right now is dominating 37 out of 40 of the world's cutting edge technologies. You're seeing their companies take market share all over the world. You like the BYDs and these types of companies. So you're seeing very positive things, which are true. But then internally, you've got this big shift of a lot of white collar workers that don't have placements right now. So the factory jobs are going away. They've put in more robots in the last 3 years than the United States has ever put in its history, right? So everything's becoming, 5G connected, and they're putting in the automation in the plants to make up for this labor shortfall. But yet you've got all these white collar young people that aren't getting the jobs that they always dreamed about. That's the main issue right now in China. It's not cataclysmic, but it's there, as I probably mentioned this going back 2 years now. that they're going to have a 5-year transition window. It's just going to it's just going to take time to reorient before the boom days are gone. We're not going to be seeing. I've never believed 5% GDP growth. The boom days are gone, because when you add 5% GDP in China, it's like adding a new Saudi Arabia, right? That's how big China is now. So it's probably squeaking along. It's doing okay. It's doing okay, but that's where basically where a lot of countries are right now. Where we're just kind of muddling through.
Yeah, I hear you. I also see it as well. I can share that even within, let's say, Singapore, BYD, I see a whole lot more BYDs than Teslas. And I can tell you there is always road work going on somewhere, and it is to upgrade the grid. So
Hmm.
the Singapore is really moving ahead. But Dan, last question here. You're in US. You lived in China for some 20 plus years. What do these two countries need to do to come to terms with one another and really start moving the world forward?
I think all this that rests on the U.S. side. So the U.S. has to understand it's a multipolar world now. We're no longer the global hegemon. We can't control the global economy or the global military space like we have done since World War II and post the end of the Cold War. Right when the Soviet Union collapsed, we became really the only global superpower. But fast forward a few decades, China is a superpower now. Russia is pretty much a military superpower. Is definitely a regional power. So the U.S., from a foreign policy standpoint, from a diplomatic standpoint, is going to have to accept and adopt the rise of China, right? Like most of the world has. China's everyone's number one trade partner, and we're going to have to look for those spaces where we produce for ourselves in areas we find as nationally strategic areas, and we're going to have to co-balance that relationship. So that's what has to be done at the highest level in Washington D.C. And they've got to get their heads around that. You don't decide what happens with Taiwan. That horse is out of the barn. That's years ago. You have no quanta of power to decide these things in Asia. So, and I think Japan and South Korea, they're very realistic countries. You see them kind of like, all right, let's trade with China. Let's work with China, because they're now the economic 800-pound gorilla. You gotta work with them. So I think they'll it starts at the top, Washington D.C. So hopefully they become more practical and realistic, and then we all can move forward into this century and make it everybody's century and not just the Chinese century. Because as always say, there can be a G2 or there can be a G1, and the G1 is not going to be the U.S. So the U.S. has to make up its mind. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a nice thought
yeah,
for everyone.
yeah.
Last point here, you mentioned one and two. Dan, you and I grew up in a time where we always heard USA, USA, USA number one, all of these things. Can the I'll just say the older population, those of us who grew up during that time, can we accept USA number two?
That's the question, and that's what Washington D.C. has to come to reckon with. Economically, we're absolutely number two right now. There's no doubt about it. If you look at the real production and economic statistics, we're not able to provide an economy anymore that keeps living standards stable. So in China, 90 some percent of the people own their own house. In the U.S. today, the average home buyer is 56 years old. Okay. Owning a home, which is basically Gen X, right? That's our generation. So the boomers are about to pass, but they've left 40 trillion in debt. The young people coming up can't afford a home, can't afford rent. They will never have a full-time job. There is massive social stratification now and wealth inequality in the U.S., where the young people are never going to afford a home at these rates. So we're completely unbalanced in the U.S. And yeah, the cheerleading and rah rah World War, we're the best. That's the World War II generation. So maybe you could say the 80s, right? But yeah, there needs to be a sober look at what's been going on. I think people in the U.S. are waking up to the to the fact they're realizing, guys, we got problems. You don't just get 100,000 fentanyl deaths annually and think everything's okay. So, yeah, I think times are changing. The U.S. needs a reboot. Europe needs a reboot. Europe's, not much better off. They're in big trouble. So, yeah, we'll see what happens.
We will see. We will see. Dan Collins, already. Can you tell the people out there how they can follow you and get more of your insights?
Sure. Follow me. You can follow me on X at Dan Collins 2011, or look me up on YouTube. I think if you Google Chaos Incorporated and my name, you'll find me. So, but yeah, look for me there.
Now's a good time to let people know about your Chaos Incorporated.
Yeah. Well, I just have a small YouTube channel where I invite people on, like just for interesting conversations, called Chaos Incorporated. It's on YouTube. We just talk about we do economics, we do a lot of geopolitics, we cover Russia, Ukraine, India, Pakistan, US economy, Chinese economy. So yeah, just do a lot of interesting topics that I find interesting, and yeah, you can check it out on YouTube. So Chaos Incorporated.
All right, Dan, appreciate it. And we'll do this again at least one more time before the year's out. That okay with you?
Awesome. Yeah, look forward to it.
All right, Dan, appreciate it, and take care of yourself.
Thanks, Patrick. You too. Take care.
That was Dan Collins sharing his view on the economy and tariffs in China. To follow more of Dan's views, go to X or Twitter and look for Dan Collins 2011. If you like this video, please do subscribe, share, and give it a thumbs up. All are greatly appreciated. Audio-only versions of this interview can be found on iTunes and Spotify.